Welcome to Shop Talk. I'm Brandy.
This is James, and we talk about all things related to cross-cultural workers and mental health.
Great. We're glad you're here. And welcome to Season 2. We've made it to Season 2.
Welcome back to another episode of Shop Talk. We're here today to talk about trauma with Dr. Phil Monroe. He leads Langberg, Monroe & Associates and is a psychologist with 3 decades of clinical experience. He is a graduate of both Westminster Seminary and Wheaton College Graduate School. After 18 years directing the Graduate School of Counseling at Missio Seminary, he continues as their visiting professor of counseling, teaching Global Trauma Recovery Institute, GTRI courses. In 2013, Dr. Monroe and Dr. Langberg launched GTRA to train counselors and humanitarians to better understand how to support trauma recovery efforts around the world. In addition, he provides ongoing direction to the Trauma Healing Institute at the American Bible Society, where materials and mentoring are created to support a global community of practice numbering over 20,000 facilitators. He has trained facilitators in Europe, the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the United States. His areas of specialty include sexual addictions, anxiety, marital distress, and trauma recovery. His personal, professional, and spiritual musings may be found at www.philipmonroe.com. It's good to see you again. Dr. Monroe and I know each other from the Trauma Healing Institute and from some adventures that we've had in different places of the world.
Well, you know, when you go with James, you end up doing things you probably should not do.
Right.
Something that seems wise in the moment, and then as you go into it, maybe less so. But
There's no way to back out.
yeah, in Amman, and you're the center, the old center is at the bottom of a valley, a ravine or a wadi, however you want to call it there. And on the top is I think it's Greek, probably, or Roman pillars, columns. It's a wonderful view from way up there at the top. And we decided, hey, let's climb up this thing, or not by the streets, but cutting our way up through the backside and grabbing onto rocks and hoping not to. Now that I know there's so many scorpions there, I would never have done it now.
There was a few points where it was borderline rock climbing up a wall.
It was a little hairy, but we'd already sold ourselves into this thing, and we were within striking distance. So we decided to pull all the way up. We get to the top, brush ourselves off, and then somebody starts yelling at us because we didn't pay to get into this thing. And then we thought we were going to be in trouble for that. But then we found out they had just closed and they wanted us to get out.
Did you have to go back down the scorpion infested?
We did not go back down that way. I think we got a taxi, didn't we?
Yeah, walked out the exit.
Is it
As
like
if we'd been there.
you claw your way up there and then you get up and there's like taxis waiting at the top?
I think he's done hairier things with other people in places like Juba.
That is actually very true. In fact, I've got a crazy story from Juba, South Sudan. Have you been there before?
No, I have not.
Juba, South Sudan is a beautiful and wild place. There's actually a hill that kind of sits and rises above the city. One time, my now wife Ellie and I were there with Margaret Hill, who you know, and Dr. Margie McCombs to do a trauma healing training for children. We went on a little adventure. The other ladies went into a market, and Ellie and I took a motorcycle to the edge of this little hill and decided we were going to hike up it. And there were people around and some people that were mining rocks, and we just kind of climbed and scrambled our way to the top of the hill, had an amazing look over the entire city, and then came back down. Ellie fell and scraped her leg. It was a fun memory. We actually learned after the fact that you're not supposed to hike that hill without a guide because there's landmines everywhere. And we had, of course, no idea until afterwards, but lesson learned, get a guide. You know, Phil, in our defense in Amman, one of us had read that you could do this hike in this particular way.
We just didn't know if we probably didn't find the right path for that. I had seen that there had been one of these Airbnb type experiences. I think that's where I'd read it. Like you can not stay in a place, but get an experience. And there was somebody who would walk from one side to the other of that. Mm-hmm. So
probably a well-marked path with signs
I don't think we found
things like that.
And that was the first time we met or spent any time together, right, Phil?
Yes, that's correct.
It's a good bonding experience. I was just looking at your website right before we started recording, and I was watching a plenary talk you gave.
Now it's probably the Restore conference in
Yes.
May.
Yes. Okay. Excellent. Excellent. I was wanting to underline everything that I heard you say there, but I'm really glad that we can talk to you today and just kind of glean from your experience and your wisdom in this area.
It's great to be here.
Right. It's a heavy topic, and I'm glad that we have people like you who have a lot of experience and a lot of wisdom in working with this. So I wonder if you could just start us off with what you're like. There are a lot of different definitions of trauma out there. And when you think about trauma, what would be your general working definition of it?
Yeah, I like to use rather simple language. I know there's a technical language that you can find in diagnostic and statistical manuals like DSM-5, but I think it's better to talk in language that we all can understand. So trauma is a wound of the heart that affects every part of our being, our bodies, our minds, our hearts, and it takes a long time to heal. Trauma is not an event so much as it is an experience. Certainly events are the start of the experience, but it really is the experience that people have. And the experience is when I am overwhelmed and cannot cope with what is happening to me, I may end up having what's long-term trauma. So when we talk about trauma, it's really the experience and the effects that someone might have from that. So that's how I start to talk about it. There are some very simple ways to talk even about the ongoing effects after the event is over, or even if it's continuing. And that is, I end up re-experiencing this event over and over. And that's not just remembering it, it's reliving it. It's as if it's happening. I feel it in my body. I might be having a nightmare, or I might be having a flashback, which is like a nightmare while your eyes are opening and you're awake. It might be triggered by smells and sounds and all sorts of things that might do so. So I'm first re-experiencing. Of course, I don't want to re-experience that. And so everything in my being wants to shut down. So I avoid places, people, things, smells. I numb. Maybe I'll use drugs and alcohol or sex or overworking or anything to not have to re-experience it. But it doesn't really work. And so I'm left on alert all the time. So that's, in a nutshell, a little bit about what trauma is. We can use this word very loosely, like, oh, I was traumatized by this, meaning I was just shocked by something, but then it goes away. But when we talk about trauma, we're talking about an ongoing, long-lasting effect. It may be soon after an event or an experience, or it may be years and decades later that it really starts to show up. But in any case, that's what we're talking about.
I witnessed an example of this just last week. I was doing some crisis counseling following a series of traumatic events in Papua New Guinea, and was working with somebody as we were processing through a fairly significant earthquake that had just happened in their area. As we were talking, we're in a wood house, somebody was just walking down the hall, and as they were walking, I could see the triggering effect that it was having on her during our session, as she felt the house shake and was able to kind of observe and experience with her that traumatic trigger of the event that had just happened. The blood starts draining from her face, her heart starts beating quicker. And one of the morals of the story is be careful doing grounding exercises in a wood house.
I wonder too if trauma, you can look at it as a reaction to a specific event, or can it also be a reaction to like ongoing series of events where maybe you don't point to one particular thing, but it's like just the buildup of stressors.
That's absolutely right. So trauma can happen in a second, like an earthquake, or something like that. It can also be a kindling effect over time that builds up where you don't actually notice that it's happening. So if you live in an area where there's violence in the community, you might actually just sort of get used to it. You might not have actually faced it directly, but its indirect effects, whether domestic abuse in a home or something that's going on out on the streets, you're likely to start to have some of those symptoms. So yes, it absolutely can happen slow, but it has the same toxic effect.
Okay.
I wonder if you could talk about how people go through the same event yet come away with their very different experiences, both in the context of our global workers, the different experience of a national who has grown up in this, and to the global workers, the expats who are experiencing something maybe for the first time.
Yeah, that's a great question. And we do see this. You can have 10 people go through the same experience or event, and they have different reactions. And some of them might meet the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, and others might have symptoms, and others might seem to be untouched by it. It's multifactorial as to reasons why. We don't really know all of the reasons. Some of it has to do with prior experiences. So someone with a lot of previous experiences with trauma is probably more likely to be traumatized by another event, whereas somebody who has less maybe have more resilience still and or more different kinds of coping skills. There's probably some biological differences amongst us. Those of us who are much more visual and empathic and feel our feelings more may be at greater risk than someone who's just better able of compartmentalizing. However, I want to make sure we really understand this, because when an event happens and someone is a lot more emotional, we might think that that person is having a harder time than the person who seems stoic and is even maybe part of the recovery process or, helping other people. But actually, there's some research out there that shows that those who feel their feelings sooner, express them, get better faster than those who kind of stuff them down for a while and seem to be quite resilient, but later on actually are struggling in greater amounts than the person who felt, dealt, and moved on, in a sense.
That's really interesting. I wonder too, if you have someone who has previously experienced trauma and who's been able to sort of process and walk through it well, how they would respond to another traumatic situation if you see that they seem to have developed the skills to respond well and walk through it well.
Yeah, we believe that will be helpful. It probably won't be so protective that I don't have any reaction to it. You think about anything else that we might have that we would see as a medical condition. Maybe I have some sort of autoimmune disorder, and I learn how to manage my diet and my sleep and my exercise, all to help maintain things. But something happens, I know how to get back there. And maybe that will give me some hope, like, yeah, I'm not feeling well now, but there are things I can do that I know will be effective in time. But it doesn't mean I don't have to do that work.
I was recently leading a traumatology training, so kind of introduction to trauma. We were talking about evacuations, which is a common experience for cross-cultural workers. And one of the issues was that I was saying not all evacuations are traumatic, which surprised some people. But in fact, I think it's important that just because something is difficult doesn't mean that it's traumatic. And I think part of that is because we often overuse the word trauma. I wonder if you could talk about some of that impact of experiences and how it's different for different people.
I don't know if this is a good example or not, but in 1994, an entire country of Rwanda and the surrounding areas, goes through the most horrific trauma that you can imagine, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a genocide. About 1 million people are killed by their neighbors in 100 days. And another 2 million flee, end up in places like Goma, DRC, to where there's still ongoing things. You would think 100% of this country should meet the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. Initially, there are very high levels, but probably when everything sort of settles out, we're looking at about 30%. So why 70% don't? Now, they don't meet criteria for a diagnosis. It doesn't mean they don't have impact.
Mm-hmm.
They may have sleeplessness. They may have, high alert. They may have some of those things, but it's not enough. We don't really know why. So we want to be careful not to first assume that everybody's going to have the same reactions. One of the reasons why some of our debriefing techniques in large groups aren't particularly helpful, because we're sort of telling everybody you have to have had this experience. And sometimes it's better to be more careful with our talking with people after event to find out what are their coping skills? We don't want to take those away.
Right.
If I can not think about something for a little bit and allow my body to calm down, that's not necessarily a bad thing. So I think that's important. It's important not to talk about trauma in sort of like superficial ways. At the same time, we also don't want people who have felt traumatized by something that many others aren't, that there's something particularly wrong with them. It doesn't really matter. They are having this experience, and we want to show compassion and curiosity about how to help them.
I wonder, Phil, if you could speak to what are some common myths that you see out there when people encounter trauma? Are there ideas about what trauma is or what it isn't?
Well, there are a wide variety of them, but we'll hit on a couple of them. One is, it's all in my head. For some trauma, it lodges in your body in such a way where you're not actually having a conscious thought before you've started to be triggered. Sometimes the conscious thought comes afterwards. So your body's already in motion and sending messages to itself that you're not safe. So that's one of them, because if it's just in my head, I should think my way out of it, but I'm going to need my whole body to help me recover, which means I'm going to have to do whole bodied practices, not just thinking about it. James, in the example you gave, of somebody who is triggered in that moment, words might help them. Oh, this is just footsteps, but their body's already reacting. And so they're going to have to do the various things to try to bring themselves back to some level of equilibrium, and not to judge and shame themselves in the process, right? The second thing is that it's a matter of faith. It should be just your faith should be able to be the protective factor. If you really trusted God, you wouldn't be afraid. You wouldn't be triggered. And I think that's a huge myth. Just recently, I had the opportunity to preach at a local church here, and did so on 1 Kings 19, which is the story of Elijah, who just had the most amazing, successful, maybe the most amazing spiritual win, because he sees God destroying the prophets of Baal, showing up that he is God and Baal is not God. How can you not have a better win than that? And on top of that, he's able to pray and rain comes after 3 years or something like that. And so he's got wins, but then Jezebel decides that she's going to have him killed by the next day, and he runs, collapses under a tree, probably runs for days, actually, collapses under a tree, wants to die, says he's no better than his ancestors. So it sounds like shame. And so if this is just a spiritual issue, why doesn't God just give him slap therapy and tell him to get back in the game? Like, what are you talking? I mean, he doesn't do that. He gives him food and water, takes care of his body, helps him recover, sends him on a journey where he talks to him again and allows him to vent his story. It's not even accurate from God's point of view, but it's still worth, being told. And then God gives him another journey. So we see here, there's no place in this time that he calls out Elijah on his faithlessness, right? That's not the issue that's at play here. So you can be traumatized and be a person of great faith.
I mean, he also doesn't challenge him on his cognitive dissonance, right? Because he easily could have said, where were you when did you not see what just happened?
Right. Right.
Like, you get some faulty thinking. He could have CBT'd him right there, but he didn't.
Phil, you touched on something there, and I heard you mention this in the video I was watching about self-compassion, how that's so important for someone who has experienced trauma, and how that can often be a really difficult thing for someone to experience. And I wonder if you can talk about that a little bit. Why it's important and why it is so hard for people who've experienced trauma to experience self-compassion too.
Well, there are probably several reasons why it's hard. I'm going to try to hit two. One is that we're just trying to make sense of the insensible. So trauma, by definition, is something that cannot make sense. It's a world that's overwhelmed us. And so how do you try to make sense? You ask why. Why is this happening? Why? Why did this happen? Why am I reacting this way? Why am I still reacting this way? And then we ask how? How can I get out of this? What am I doing wrong? I should be, other people seem to be able to get better. How can I get out of this mess, this hell I'm living in? And when we ask these kinds of questions, we often come away with this sense of shame of there's something wrong with me, that I experienced this, and there's something wrong with me that I'm still experiencing this. And so self-compassion will be like, something is happening to me and I don't love it and I want to be out of it. And the more I shame myself, the less I'm able to do, right? There's a second reason why we struggle with self-compassion, why we need it, is because other people are often offering us very unhelpful armchair advice, like, well, why don't you do this? Or my cousin did that, or, you shouldn't take medication because, it's a spiritual issue, or whatever it is that people offer, and it's not particularly helpful. But we are fearfully and wonderfully made. And if we are bearing the image of God in us, then we ought to take courage and have curiosity about how he's made us and what our bodies are able to do, even when they are broken and they aren't working the way they should. So this is where we start. Self-compassion is really emulating God's compassion for us.
There's a myth that we've touched on that's also about people comparing their experiences to others. And as you were shooting, in your imagination of this event, that's what people do. They're doing fine. I saw this a lot just the last couple of weeks. Post-earthquake, there's people who are struggling, and it's perfectly reasonable for them to do. But there's a sense of, but others are doing fine. And in that comes the message of shame and all of those expectations. And
shame, it seems like shame is such an easy thing for us to go to. And it takes a lot of work to not just spiral into that.
I agree. It's a very common human experience. And one of the beautiful images in scripture is in Genesis, where God goes and pursues people who are hiding in shame, Adam and Eve, right? And we can even look at this and say, well, they deserve this, because they had done wrong. But God's first move is to go find them. And one of the things that helps us heal shame is when people are around us who aren't put off by our mess.
Absolutely.
And when we can do that for others and we can do that for ourselves, we can heal.
It leads into one of the questions I have for you is, how can we help other cross-cultural workers, or help cross-cultural workers help each other? As maybe you teammates are working through traumatic experience, or they've experienced trauma. How can we teach others to relate well and support others well when they're going through trauma?
Yeah, I think probably the first and best way to help someone is to invite them to tell their story, or any portion thereof. They may not want to tell their story. They may not be ready to tell it. But even if they can tell what it's like to be in their bodies right now. So being a student of others, giving them space to talk without judgment and shame or correction, these are huge ways that we can give people space. So when we are able to express curiosity and compassion and interest, what are we doing? We're bearing witness. We are keeping watch. When Jesus is about to go to the cross, he asks his disciples to keep watch with him in the midst of his pain. So when we keep watch with others and listen, we are in essence emulating what Jesus needed, right? We are doing what he's called his disciples to do, us, to keep watch. Doesn't feel like you're doing much. It can feel like we're just circling and circling and circling on the same issues. But guess what? That's what needs to happen in trauma recovery. People need to have the space to tell the story again as they're trying to make sense of the insensible.
In that same vein, I wonder if you could talk about two types of people who experience trauma: those who have this deep desire to not talk about it, to try not to think about it, and then the other side, those who just can't stop talking about it, in an unhealthy way.
Yeah, we have a lot of different reactions, don't we, to something like this? And the person who wants to talk and the person who doesn't want to talk. The first thing I would say, we don't force people into recovery, force them to stop talking into recovery, force them to start talking into recovery. You can't use force to heal where force took something from someone.
Yeah, I liked in your video, you talked about you can't control someone else's recovery through trauma. I think that's a really good thing for us to think about.
That said, right. And that's absolutely true. But that said, there are obviously some wisdom that we might have here. So for the person who does not want to talk about it, again, we give them permission to not talk about it, but we may talk about, you don't have to talk about it, what's happening in your body. So you can talk about your experiences in the here and now. You can practice ways for calming. If you see somebody who is frozen and shut down, you want to think about things that would help warm them up, movement and activity, and things for them to do that feel like they are, making a place in the world and having impact. If they're overactive, then you're trying to like cool them some and help them calm. And so you're working very much on just sort of very physical activities. For the person who is wanting to tell their story over and over and in a way that you can see is re-triggering, and it's not re-traumatizing them. I don't want to say that they are traumatized, but it's flooding them. Then part of my job is to slow them down just a little bit. Can you come back? I know you're in the middle of that story, but I want you to open your eyes maybe and look around. Can we just talk about the tree outside and what it looks like? Can we notice what's happening in our bodies right now? So when we are working on recovery from trauma, we are using words to bring our body back into the story. And it's not so much about telling the story, it's about noticing what's happening. Where do we feel that in our bodies? It's in our chest, it's in my stomach, it's in the back of my head. What are some things we can do, even standing up or sitting down or lengthening our spine or something like that, that's telling my body now, here in, this moment, this month, that I'm okay.
I appreciate that you bring the body into this quite a bit, because it isn't something that just happens psychologically to us. It really is a whole integrated experience when we experience the trauma and then we work through it.
Well, I think it's something I've had to learn over time, because I would have been that person who had bobblehead theology, the big head. It's all about what we know and what we think. I have a BA in theology and MA in religion. It took time for me to realize I was ignoring 90% of my body and what was really going on in somebody's life.
Right. You didn't realize your shoulders were like up to here.
Yeah.
I mean, even some of the first critical incident stress debriefing was just really cognitive heavy. It wasn't about the experience. It was like, just tell what happened and do it as soon as you can. And I'm often having conversations of actually, it doesn't need to be in this 24 to 48 magic window that used to be, we need to process our story to prevent PTSD. And it's more about our bodies being at a calmer state. What's some of your experience about kind of timeline? Somebody experiences a traumatic event towards getting help.
It is helpful when there are people to help process. Now, process does not always mean talking. It could be somebody who's just present and connecting. So we know that social support is a good protective factor during a traumatic event. So there are people who know, see, understand. I don't have to explain myself. There are things that I can do. I'm in a community where I'm not ostracized. These are things that can help. So we think about trauma being individual, but as you know, whole communities can be traumatized. But when a community is able to make space for our experience, I might not even have to talk about it to know that, this is normal. The fact that we're all fuzzy brained and we can't think and we kind of feel robotic going through things. But we were able to set up, a place for our kids to get some schooling, and we were able to make sure we got good housing and some food and water, things that help start to calm our system. The sooner the better. But sitting down and telling what happened, it really depends on the person. So that's why we don't want to just force people to do that.
Have you noticed in working with cross-cultural workers any trends or changes in how cross-cultural workers experience trauma in the past few years.
Brandy, of course, is operating on the assumption that our cross-cultural workers are experiencing trauma, which in my experience is an absolutely fair assumption to make.
It's definitely fair. I would say some of the trends are similar to before, which is, well, trauma is supposed to happen to other people, not me. So we are first still trying to burst that myth bubble, right? That it's really happening to other people. I'm supposed to be the help. Why am I having this reaction? So we are still in needing of normalizing that trauma happens to everybody. It's no respecter of persons and knowledge and experience. The second thing I think also that is important to talk about, and maybe is a little dicey, but how the sending agency responds to stress and distress has a huge influence on whether somebody develops trauma. I have a lot of people who are cross-cultural workers who have felt like the bullets and the potential violence that they are facing is far less traumatizing than the fact that their sending agency, it seems unresponsive and uncaring about certain things that are happening in their life. So it still comes back to, and many people, there are two wounds in trauma. There's the thing that happens to me, and then there's the way my community responds to me. And especially those who are supposed to be taking care of me respond to me in that process. That second wound can be bigger than the first. So that's some, those are still probably the most common things I'm seeing in my clinical work with folks. And despite the fact that more and more people want to know about trauma sensitive care and trauma informed ministry, we still have a long ways to go.
If you can have free reign to talk with some sending agencies about how you would like to see them respond to trauma, what would you say?
Well, I do know that sending agencies sometimes do, and probably frequently do, sort of what they hope is preventive work before teams go, right? So they put you through like a security training and something like that to know how to handle when you're being, in a threatening environment. Some of those, frankly, aren't as helpful as the agency thinks they are. And some of the people who may do those trainings may enjoy sort of the like mock, put the black bag over your head and interview you or interrogate you. I'm not sure that that's actually helpful. I think what's probably helpful is practice. What we know is practicing talking to each other, making it out of games, helping people understand. But we don't just do it once and then send you on the field. We need to have repeated experiences. Like if you're going to do a fire drill, you don't do it once and assume that everybody's going to have figured it out what to do under stress. You've got to practice. First responders practice all the time about how to bandage something, how to take care of something, how to respond, because if you don't practice, you lose it. So that's how if I had free reign, have people come off the field, do things on the field where you're practicing and not treating it as if it's, something we should just all know how to do.
We had a lot of people evacuated from a country last year. One particular family, kind of leading up to it, one of the statements they said in their debriefing with me was that we just never thought this was a possibility. And it's like, that doesn't make any sense.
Do you know where you live?
Yeah. Brandy lived in a neighboring country up there too. I mean, it was one of those things. They probably had, before they left, some sort of pre-field encounter experience, which I've also had to do trauma debriefings from people who just do the training, because that'll bring stuff up. And then they just hadn't thought about it. And even though other conversations were happening, they hadn't been included in some of the bigger conversations about it. And it was a surprise.
Oh.
And that impacted how they were impacted.
It's probably the way a person would cope in a unsafe environment is to have to keep believing it's not going to happen. I just add to this, sexual assault is possible anywhere, right? And this is one of the forms of trauma that aid workers might experience or could experience. you don't want to live always, in this on alert stage where it's, around every corner. But also training and awareness of it doesn't stop. If somebody's bigger and stronger than you, there's not a whole lot you can do, right? So let's, as sending agencies, be aware of and check on people. And then if something does happen, that we are not treating there's something wrong with them. Other people wouldn't have this reaction.
Mm.
So normalize reactions.
Yes.
Talking about how people respond whenever you go through trauma. I mean, this was years ago for us when our son was first diagnosed with a physical disability. It was pretty difficult experience for us. And people would come to me crying and their sadness. And I'm like, do I comfort you now? I'm kind of falling apart here. Like, what am I supposed to do with this? This isn't helping. But it's very, very interesting how there's a myriad of ways that people don't respond well. And there's a myriad of ways people can respond really well too, really beautifully.
It's really true. And this is why we have to be students of the people who we love and are around.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of assuming the things that I want to do that might help me will help you.
Mm-hmm.
Part of that is getting to know you well enough to know what you need and to adjust when I do something that I can see on your body probably wasn't the most helpful thing to say or do.
What can you do as cross-cultural workers to build resiliency? If you're, the likelihood of experiencing trauma is probably kind of high and you're a cross-cultural worker, what are some things you can do to build resiliency?
Well, let's talk about resiliency too. A lot of people define it as, bouncing back or not being affected by what's happening. I don't really like that because I think we're not rubber balls. We don't bounce back. We continue our story. We continue telling our story, but with new features when things happen, right? That's really the question. How do we continue telling our story? First, we accept that sometimes we need rest and we need to be off the field. It's okay. It doesn't mean there's a failure for us. We don't put our soldiers on the front line and leave them there for years, right? They get regular rest. Even the military understands this. If they want people to be a finely tuned machine, then they have to actually provide care for that machine. Now, I'm not saying that our military does a great job with that, but that's the thinking. But it's not often the thinking in ministry. So first off, give rest, find ways to get real rest. And both rest in leaving and rest on the field. We need to have places for that. We need to have places where we are getting real connection. So one of the things that probably hinders resiliency is conflict on a team. Addressing that and keeping our conflict at bay, figuring it out, and paying attention to that is a huge portion of resiliency. Lament is actually something that helps people feel connected to God and each other when we can speak about the pains in our hearts in complaining fashion, like the psalmist does over and over again. We are probably going to, be able to be more resilient. When we talk about our mistakes and the things that we want to do different, and we recognize that every day we get to try again, that's likely to build resilience because we realize, we get to adjust and try again.
Listening to you, I wonder if people hold resiliency up with this idea of resiliency that maybe isn't so healthy after trauma, but I appreciate how you look at it through a different lens.
We've held up ideas. This person stayed on the field for 30 years and never left, and they might have something really different about them, but that's not necessarily the outlier that we want to say as the norm.
I think there's a sense that even after trauma, people desire to be back to whatever it was before. It's the same thing with burnout. If somebody is going through burnout, their question to me is often, well, when I could get back to my normal level of work, production, lifestyle, it's like, well, never, please, never. That's what got you here. There's this learning aspect that we are different and we will never be the same, but that doesn't mean that now can't be okay.
Right. Like the new normal can really be a beautiful place, but it's a new place. You have to learn how to navigate.
That's really true. And one thing that just came to my mind as you guys were talking is there's another problem that a sending agency could make a mistake, and that is becoming paternalistic and deciding for people what they need to do. Like, you have to leave the field and never go back. I think it needs to be more dialogue. And yes, there may be a decision. We don't think you are in a place right now where you can be on the field, and we want to care for you, not drop you like a hot potato. But there might be somebody who experiences a really traumatic event, and for their recovery, it would be helpful for them to go back, at least temporarily, to meet people, to see things, to have a better ending. We need to have dialogue about these sorts of things rather than decide for people what's best for them. So that's hard because that policies tend to be rigid. But if we're really going to care well for people that we're sending, we're probably needing to have some combination between policy and conversation.
In a way that a lot of times that person may need to relocate because of the cost they have on the people around them after a traumatic incident.
Yeah.
And people already living at the edge of their margins, not being able to carry that weight.
Right.
Could you talk just a little bit about what secondary trauma is and how people can be aware of perhaps what the impact is on them of hearing other stories?
The idea of secondary trauma or vicarious trauma, we use those terms interchangeably, is that those who are listening to the stories, those who are walking alongside somebody who has been traumatized, may end up having a lot of the same experiences and features inside them as a result. You can kind of almost imagine this, if you are the receptacle for lots of other people's trauma, then you're going to be filled up with toxins yourself, right? And so it's not surprising that we see people who are listening to a lot of stories, whether, the mental health workers like ourselves or first responders or others, who start to experience the same senses of hypervigilance or, re-experiencing, re-remembering, or reliving what somebody else's story is, a numbing, trying to shut down. So that's common. And we need to recognize then that those people who are walking alongside other traumatized people, whether it's people who live there and they're trying to help, or it's other aid workers, that they too need a place to talk and process and to have all the same kinds of care available to them as the person who experienced the direct traumatic event and experience.
I wonder, Phil, if you have some resources that you would recommend as we, this goes out to mostly cross-cultural workers, our podcast does. If you have some books or articles that you'd recommend, or we can attach them to our notes on our podcast.
Yeah, I think there are a number of things, if you want to learn more about trauma, that Diane Langberg, my mentor and colleague, has done. She has a pretty sizable YouTube channel. So DianeLangberg.com is her website. She talks a lot about complex trauma, and abuse and abuse of power. So lots of topics there that can be helpful, and really engaging with stories from around the world in that. She has several books, Suffering in the Heart of God, How Trauma Destroys and Christ Restores, I think is the title. Another book recently on abuse of power. But one of the nice things, if somebody's looking for a devotional, she has a book, and I get no royalties from this, so these are not advertisements, but In Our Lives First. It's a small devotional you can read. It's just like 2 pages per devotional, some pithy words from her, a quote, a scripture, and it can be a good way to just, address your own heart before the Lord, if that's something that you like to do. High quality things about faith and also about the clinical approach to trauma. If a person wants to know more about somatic therapies, where you're caring more for your body, I think Jenena Fisher, JenenaFisher.com would be a great resource to see some free stuff that just helps a person take more compassion and curiosity for what's happening inside their bodies and some things that they might do. It's very clinical minded, but it's also written in some very simple language, the illustrations in our handbook and on that website. So those are two resources that I think might be beneficial. And then, of course, I should do a shout out for Trauma Healing Institute .org because there's materials there for people who want to talk about trauma healing from a faith-based perspective.
And how can our listeners get in touch with you if they'd like to do that?
Langbergmonroe.com is our clinical site. They can right there. There's a way to send an email to me.
It's been delightful talking with you. I feel like I could just talk to you for hours about this. Just appreciate your wisdom and experience in this.
Well, thank you for what you guys do in caring well for people around the world. Much appreciated.
Phil, thanks so much for being here, and thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.